Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. In the autumn of 1907, in the high country of western Montana, 18 miles north of the settlement, known as Deer Lodge, a man named Harold Voss completed construction of a timber cabin that would become the subject of considerable ridicule among his neighbors. The structure stood at the edge of a narrow valley, where the Clark Fork River bent sharply eastward, sheltered on three sides by dense stands of lodgepole pine, and on the fourth by a granite outcropping that rose nearly 80 feet above the forest floor. What made the cabin noteworthy was not its location, which seemed sensible enough, but rather the manner of its construction, which struck most observers as excessive to the point of absurdity. The walls measured 14 inches thick, built from double layers of hand-hewn logs with a 6-inch gap between them, packed floor to ceiling with a mixture of sawdust, clay, and dried moss. The foundation descended 4 feet into bedrock, mortared with lime that Voss had hauled by wagon from a kiln 32 miles distant. The roof beams were Douglas fir, each one 16 inches across, supporting not one but 3 layers of split cedar shakes, with birch bark laid between each layer. The chimney rose from a firebox constructed of sandstone blocks, each stone hand-selected and numbered in Voss's ledger according to heat resistance and position in the structure. He had purchased 47 cords of seasoned larch and stored them in a woodshed built on the northern exposure, its own walls insulated with the same sawdust clay mixture as the main cabin. Thomas Brenner, whose homestead lay 7 miles downstream, visited the construction site in late September and later described the cabin in a letter to his brother in Illinois as a monument to fear disguised as prudence. Brenner himself lived in a frame house of conventional design, built the previous spring for 1/3 the cost and in 1/4 the time Voss had invested in his fortress of timber and stone. When asked about the discrepancy, Voss offered only that he preferred to build once rather than repair often, a response that Brenner and others interpreted as a veiled criticism of their own methods. The routine of the valley settled into the familiar patterns of late autumn. Men sharpened saw blades and checked trap lines. They hauled the last loads of hay into lofts and slaughtered hogs for winter provisions. Wives rendered fat and packed meat in salt barrels. The post-rider made his circuit twice monthly, weather permitting, bringing newspapers from Helena that were often 6 weeks old by the time they reached the valley. The Great Northern Railway maintained a water station at Garrison, 14 miles south, where supplies could be ordered by telegram and collected when the schedule allowed. It was a system that functioned adequately in all but the harshest conditions, and the settlers had learned to time their preparations accordingly. Voss conducted himself with the same methodical attention he had shown in his construction. He kept detailed records in a series of ledgers bound in oilcloth, daily temperatures recorded at dawn, midday, and dusk, precipitation measured in a copper gauge of his own fabrication, wind direction noted according to a system of his own devising. He inventoried his supplies weekly, listing each item with its quantity and projected depletion date. On the 1st of November, his records showed 160 pounds of flour, 80 pounds of cornmeal, 40 pounds of salt pork, 23 pounds of dried beans, 11 pounds of coffee, 6 gallons of molasses, and quantities of other provisions sufficient, by his calculation, to sustain one person for 17 weeks without resupply. Brenner mentioned these preparations to the postmaster at Garrison, who repeated them with amusement to the station master, who in turn shared them with travelers passing through. The story evolved, with each telling until it became accepted wisdom in the valley that Voss was either preparing for the end of civilization or suffering from some Eastern anxiety unsuited to Western life. The general opinion held that a man who built walls 14 inches thick and stored 17 weeks of provisions was a man who did not understand the resilience of Montana weather or the reliability of the railway schedule. The first snow arrived on November 19th, earlier than usual, but not alarmingly so. 3 inches fell overnight, melting within 2 days. The second storm came on the 27th, depositing 7 inches that remained on the ground through the first week of December. The post rider completed his circuit on December 10th, arriving at Brenner's homestead with mail and a newspaper from Helena dated November 21st. The lead article reported unseasonably cold temperatures across the Northern Territories and urged residents to check provisions, though the advice was general enough to apply to any winter in any year. On December 14th, the temperature dropped to 6 degrees below zero. On the 15th, it reached 13 below. The sky remained clear, a pale blue that seemed to intensify the cold, rather than offer any promise of warming. On the night of December 16th, the temperature fell to 22 below zero, and the wind began to blow from the northwest, with a persistence that suggested something fundamental had changed in the architecture of the season. By dawn on the 17th, the thermometer at Brenner's homestead registered 31 below, and snow had begun to fall in a fine, dry powder that the wind drove horizontally across the valley floor. The blizzard continued without interruption for 41 hours. When it finally ceased on the morning of December 19th, the valley lay beneath drifts measuring 8 to 14 feet in depth, with certain protected areas blown nearly clear to bare ground and other exposed sections buried under accumulations that would not fully melt until the following April. The wind had stripped shakes from roofs, torn doors from hinges, and collapsed the woodshed belonging to a homesteader named Peterson, whose claim lay 9 miles north of Brenner's property. The temperature remained below zero, without exception, for the next 11 days. The post rider attempted his circuit on December 22nd, but turned back after reaching a point 4 miles south of Brenner's homestead, where drifts had rendered the trail impassable. He returned to Garrison and sent a telegram to Helena reporting conditions beyond his capacity to navigate. The railway schedule, which had maintained reasonable punctuality through the autumn, began to deteriorate as snow accumulated on the tracks faster than section crews could clear it. A freight train scheduled to depart Missoula on December 20th did not reach Garrison until December 28th. The next scheduled train, due on December 23rd, did not arrive until January 2nd. At the Brenner homestead, the initial assessment of the storm was that it represented an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Brenner possessed adequate flour, salt pork, and coffee for several weeks, and his woodshed, though partially damaged, contained sufficient fuel for immediate needs. His chimney drew well, and his roof, though missing perhaps a dozen shakes on the southern exposure, remained fundamentally sound. He expected the post rider to attempt another circuit within a week or at most 10 days, and he anticipated that the railway would resume regular service shortly thereafter. It was the sort of optimism that had characterized most of his decisions since arriving in Montana, and it had served him adequately through 2 previous winters. By the 8th day after the blizzard, Brenner's flour supply had diminished to 37 pounds. His coffee was nearly exhausted, and he had been burning wood at a rate that left him with perhaps 12 days of fuel, assuming temperatures did not drop further. He attempted to reach the nearest neighboring homestead, belonging to a man named Kowalski, but turned back after struggling through drifts for 2 hours and covering less than half a mile. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was actively dangerous, numbing exposed skin within minutes and making each breath feel like an assault on the lungs. It was on the 9th day, December 28th, that Brenner made the decision to attempt reaching Voss's cabin. The distance was 7 miles, but the route followed the river valley where wind had cleared certain sections to bare ground or shallow snow, making passage theoretically possible if conditions held. He departed at first light, carrying a canvas pack containing a wool blanket, matches, and the remainder of his coffee, with the intention of asking Voss for a temporary loan of flour and perhaps inquiring whether Voss had any recent information from Garrison. He arrived at Voss's cabin in the late afternoon, exhausted from the journey and suffering from frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. Voss opened the door without comment and gestured for Brenner to enter. Inside, the cabin was warm enough that Brenner removed his coat within minutes. A fire burned steadily in the sandstone firebox, and the air smelled of coffee and pine resin. Voss provided Brenner with a basin of lukewarm water for his frost-bitten fingers, and served coffee in tin cups without asking whether Brenner wanted any. The interior of the cabin was as methodically organized as the construction had suggested. Supplies lined shelves built into the double-thick walls, each item labeled and positioned according to frequency of use. A table held Voss's ledgers, still maintained daily despite the isolation. The floor was swept clean, and the windows, though small, had been fitted with shutters that could be opened or closed to regulate heat and light. The temperature inside remained constant at a level that allowed a man to work without heavy clothing, but never warm enough to encourage idleness or waste of fuel. Brenner explained his situation, making no attempt to minimize his need. Voss listened without interruption, and then retrieved a ledger, turning to a page where he had recorded projected depletion dates for various households in the valley. According to his calculations, based on typical consumption rates and the date of the last supply delivery, Brenner should have exhausted his flour supply within the next 4 days, his salt pork within 9, and his firewood within 13. The accuracy of the projection was unsettling, not because it was hostile, but because it demonstrated that Voss had been anticipating this conversation for weeks. Voss provided Brenner with 40 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, and 6 pounds of coffee, recording the transaction in his ledger as a loan with no specified repayment date. He also offered information that Brenner had not requested. Based on historical temperature patterns and current conditions, Voss estimated that the cold would persist for at least another 3 weeks, possibly 5, and that resupply via the normal routes would not be feasible until late January at the earliest. He suggested that Brenner consider reducing his daily firewood consumption by confining himself to a single room and blocking off unused portions of his house. Brenner returned to his homestead the following morning, carrying the supplies in his pack and struggling with questions he had not fully formed. The loans solved his immediate crisis, but did not address the larger pattern that was becoming visible. Voss had not built a cabin 14 inches thick because he was paranoid. He had built it because he understood something about the nature of margins that Brenner and the others had not considered. The valley had always seemed forgiving, at least in retrospect, but that forgiveness was a function of favorable conditions that could change without warning or apology. The cold continued through January. On January 3rd, the temperature dropped to 47 below zero, a record for the valley according to the fragmentary records available. The Post writer made one final attempt to complete his circuit on January 6th, but turned back after encountering drifts that had refrozen into barriers of ice. The railway struggled to maintain any schedule at all, with trains arriving in Garrison days behind their published times and sometimes not arriving at all. News from Helena, when it came, reported similar conditions across Montana and north into Canada, with stockmen losing cattle and settlements rationing coal. 2 other homesteaders in the valley made the journey to Voss's cabin in mid-January, each arriving separately and each requesting temporary assistance with provisions. Voss provided what they needed and recorded the transactions in his ledger with the same neutral precision he applied to temperature readings. He did not lecture them, nor did he express satisfaction at their predicament. He treated the matter as a logistical problem with a logistical solution, and he offered the supplies because refusing them would have served no practical purpose. By late January, the pattern had become clear to anyone willing to examine it. Voss had built his cabin the way he had built it because he was planning not for the expected winter, but for the winter that occasionally occurred beyond expectation. The 14-inch walls were not excessive. They were appropriate to conditions that arrived infrequently but inevitably. The 17 weeks of provisions were not paranoid. They were calculated to cover the gap between the last reliable resupply and the first possible resupply under deteriorated conditions. The ledgers were not obsessive. They were tools for managing information in an environment where information could mean the difference between adequacy and crisis. The winter of 1907-1908 would be recorded in county histories as one of exceptional severity, though the records themselves are fragmentary. A report filed with the Montana Department of Agriculture in March of 1908 noted widespread livestock losses and delayed planting, but the report focused primarily on economic impacts and said little about the human experience of those months. A letter written by Thomas Brenner to his brother in Illinois, dated February 14, 1908, described the winter as harder than I had understood possible, and mentioned that he had been forced to seek assistance from a neighbor whose preparations he had previously considered excessive. In April, when the snow finally receded and the post rider resumed his regular circuit, Brenner visited Voss's cabin again, this time bringing a side of smoked pork and 30 pounds of flour as repayment for the January loans. Voss accepted the repayment and recorded it in his ledger, but he also provided Brenner with copies of certain pages from his records, temperature patterns for the previous 3 winters, precipitation measurements, and calculations for firewood consumption at various levels of insulation. The gesture was not offered as instruction, but rather as information that might prove useful. In the years following, several homesteaders in the valley modified their construction methods. Brenner added a second layer of logs to his north-facing wall and increased his winter provisions to a 10-week supply. Kowalski rebuilt his chimney using sandstone and redesigned his woodshed to prevent collapse under snow load. These changes were not dramatic, but they represented a shift in thinking about the relationship between preparation and risk. The final piece of the story emerges from a document discovered in 1963 when the county courthouse in Deer Lodge underwent renovation and a collection of old homestead records was transferred to the Montana Historical Society. Among these records was a letter from Harold Voss to the county surveyor, dated October 1907, requesting verification of building specifications. In the letter, Voss explained that he was constructing his cabin according to standards he had observed in northern Norway, where his family had farmed for 3 generations in conditions similar to those he expected in Montana. He noted that his father had taught him to build for the worst winter in 20 years rather than the average winter, and he included detailed sketches of wall construction, foundation depth, and chimney design. The letter was filed without response, stamped received, but apparently never answered. It suggests that Voss's methods were not invented out of anxiety, but inherited from a different tradition of risk management, one shaped by centuries of experience with climates that offered little tolerance for error. What his neighbors interpreted as paranoia was actually a form of practical wisdom transmitted across generations, encoded not in abstract principles, but in the specific dimensions of walls and the depth of foundations. Harold Voss continued to live in the valley until 1919, when he sold his property and moved to Seattle. The cabin remained standing until 1947, when it was dismantled to salvage the timber. By that time, most of the original homesteaders had either died or moved away, and the settlement patterns that had defined the valley in 1907 had shifted to accommodate roads, electricity, and a world where 17 weeks of isolation was no longer a realistic possibility. But those who had lived through that winter remembered it, and some of them passed the memory along, that there had once been a man who built walls 14 inches thick, and that when the cold came, he had been proven not paranoid but prudent. The lesson, if there is one, has less to do with specific construction techniques than with the fundamental question of how we assess risk in environments where consequences are deferred until the moment of crisis. Voss understood that the cost of over-preparation is measured in labor and materials, while the cost of under-preparation is measured in survival. In a landscape where the margin between adequacy and catastrophe could vanish in a single storm, the rational choice was not to optimize for the average case, but to build for the exceptional one, even if that choice invited ridicule from those who had not yet encountered conditions that would make the wisdom visible.